안녕하세요. Thank you very much for inviting me here today.
No problem at all.
I like to start with this quote every time I give a talk. It is not directly related to the subject matter, but I think it's important to share these thoughts. Whenever I am not sure of what I should do, if I feel I have lost a little bit of direction, I remind myself with this quote. So instead of asking what the world needs, I ask, what is it that makes me get up in the morning and go? Because that's what we need more of. People following their hearts and doing the things that make them get up in the morning. And every time I give a talk, I like to share this because I don't think we hear that enough. To follow your instincts, follow your heart, and do what feels right. Do what gives you enough energy to continue moving forward. Find what drives you and follow that. I started this talk calling it Build Our Future. And I feel, perhaps I started a little too soon because I was asked to give a talk about humans and technology. So I added a tagline, humans living with technology. And then I decided this was a terrible tagline, so I changed it to humans living because of technology. And that seemed a little too powerful to me, so I changed it to humans living in spite of technology. And that didn't work either, so I tried humans hate technology, build our future. And I didn't like that either, so I went to the other end of the spectrum and I chose my friend technology, build your future. But at this point I realized that build our future wasn't a part of the talk at all, and the whole thing was an absolute disaster and my talk was done. I was very upset. I had experienced these amazing elated emotions, these incredible highs, and I have experienced the deepest of the lows. Total time, 3 seconds, all in my head. I had created, I had iterated, I had produced, and I had iterated and produced and iterated and produced. In my head, 3 seconds, I absolutely destroyed my talk. And then it became clear. There was only one title for this talk. Humans and Technology, a Love Story. Where else do you feel the great highs and the terrible lows? It must be love. Because it's a relationship, humans and technology, right? And in every relationship, we come across a moment where we ask ourselves, what am I doing here? Whether it's social, whether it's intimate, whether it's a business relationship, we say, what am I doing in this relationship? So we ask ourselves, what am I doing in this relationship? And, what am I doing here, right? And why are we in a relationship? Why do we enter into any relationship? Because we all have one thing that we would like to see. We want to see a better tomorrow. I am doing this because I want tomorrow to be better. I want to survive. And that's the key to what we are doing here, right? We are surviving as human beings. Maybe it doesn't feel like it because in our day-to-day life, surviving is very easy, right? We have food, we have water, we have electricity, but there was a time when we could not do this. So on one side of the relationship, we have humans surviving. And in order for us to survive, we need a little bit of help. So we create some tools. Another word for tools is technology. And in order for us to continue living and surviving and prospering, we need to develop these tools. We need to develop this technology. So on the other side of this relationship, we have developing technologies. And this creates something of a feedback loop. Now there's several different ways to describe a feedback loop. One is the circle with two arrows pointing at each other. I like this one. And I like this one for a very specific reason, because it has this point in the illustration. This is a crossover. And it's in this crossover that we have what we call technological triggers. These are moments where technology and humans take a huge step forwards. So maybe every day you get a simple update. Maybe every day something changes a little bit, but every once in a while something happens that everything moves forward and nothing is ever the same again. So I've split the talk into 3 sections. Since it is a love story, they meet. They go on the honeymoon, and they live happily ever after. They meet 12,000 years ago. Now, 12,000 years ago, in ancient Egypt, there were the nomadic people who would travel around the grasslands, hunters-gatherers, and they lived a very good life, traveling around, hunting what they needed, eating, they had fresh water, good food. But then there was a little bit of climate change. The rain stopped coming. The animals started dying off. There was no more food. So what did they do? They went to the nearest water source, the Nile, and they set up camp there. They stopped becoming nomadic, and they started to build towns, and they started farming, and they started growing food. Fields of wheat, and they prospered. And with the food, they were able to grow their population. They had more people. And with more people, they had to grow more food. I grew up on a farm, so maybe this touches me a little more than anyone who has grown up in a city. However, at a certain point, if you're planting food by hand, you can only grow so much food. And this is where things changed. The first trigger. I think this trigger is what created modern civilization. It's a very big claim to make. But it changed everything. And not only did this trigger change things for the people living in ancient Egypt, but it changed things for us today. Because not only does a trigger change one thing for everybody, it creates a domino effect of inventions and innovations that are the result of this one moment, this one change. And in ancient Egypt, it was this. This is a plow, and farmers use it to turn the land. You connect it to some horse and some oxen. You connect it to horse and oxen, and you're able to plow a field in one day, whereas before, by hand, it would take you a week. So, with this, they started growing more food. They could feed more people. But then their cities grew, and then they got more people. They had to grow more food. So the domino effect behind the plow was all of a sudden a whole series of inventions had to occur. The first one, a storage system. Clay pots, durable clay pots that they were able to store their food in. Irrigation system so that they could have bigger fields to grow more food. a system of writing so that we could write on the pot and say whose wheat was what, and write records of who did I sell my wheat to, and who do I send my invoice to so that they can pay me. There's a domino effect behind every trigger that is exponentially ripples throughout a culture. And in a very short time, from the town of Aswan all the way up to the Mediterranean, the Egyptians built an empire with a handful of technologies. The plow, basic writing, simple metallurgy, irrigation systems. They built an empire that we still talk about today. We are in awe of what they did with so little. But it's the town of Alexandria that I find particularly interesting. So if you have not heard of Alexandria, it was a port town, and they had a law in Alexandria that said, if you and your ship come into town, you have to come to the library and you give us your maps and your documents. And we will copy the documents, and then we will keep the originals and we will give you the copies, and then you can go. And that was the law. Alexandria was our first data center. And when you have a data center, when you start collecting and sharing data, we get communication. We start talking to each other. A conversation happens. We start exchanging ideas and opinions. And maybe two people get together and they say, oh, our ideas kind of work together. Maybe we should put them together and make something new. Why? Because we want to survive. Because we want to see this happen. Total time of iteration, 4,000 years to build an empire. We go on the honeymoon. We're going to jump forward to the year 2000. In the year 2000, and I was not the first person to start working with this, but these are microprocessors. People had been working with them for many years before the year 2000, but I feel it was really in the year 2000 that it became mainstream. More and more people were realizing that you could go down to the sort of the local electronics store, buy a couple of them, use a little bit of wire, and start making LEDs go on and off in your home. There was free software. And if you had the right books or a friend who had already done it, you could wire up your own circuit and start experimenting with basic inputs and outputs. So around the year 2000, we were building this. And we were connecting LEDs and motors and other chips, just trying to see what we could do. But the internet, though it was very popular at this time, there was very little information online. There was no, there was no SparkFun, there was no YouTube, there were no tutorials. Nobody was trying to help each other because it still hadn't quite caught on yet. And a lot of times, everything looked like this. I don't understand this. Another thing that happened at this time is we started playing with technology, and I choose my words carefully. Playing with technology, we found that there were a couple of different attitudes about this out in the public. A lot of people said things like, I am not a computer person, and my computer hates me. So we continue playing with technology, and we jump forward to 2005. So this is a 5-year gap. One day, we get this kit in the mail, and we solder it together, and we plug it into the computer, and we program it with some very buggy software, and all of a sudden we're doing with this in a few minutes what it used to take hours by building our own circuit. So in a lot of ways, this became the new plow. In hours, I could be prototyping my ideas in what used to take a whole afternoon. It may look a little familiar to you because it turned into this. That's the original. It ran off of RS-232. USB was maybe on one or two different computers, but it still sported, well, it started with an AT Mega 8, which is a very different chip in terms of memory and speed, but all the same, it's an Arduino. So now we have this ubiquitous method of rapidly prototyping our ideas. And that's what happened, a trigger. There was an explosion. For $35 US, you could buy one of these Arduinos and a few LEDs, and you were doing the same thing that scientists have been doing for years before. All of a sudden, information and knowledge had become accessible to everybody. Then we found that there are a few other attitudes opened up. We found that there were some people who I just want it to work. I want to plug this in, I want it to go. And not just the Arduino, but their computer, their refrigerator, their attitude towards technology is just, I turn it on and it goes. But then there was another group of people, and we wanted to know how it worked. We wanted to open it up. We wanted to take it apart. We kept asking ourselves, what does it take to break this? How can I break this? So our parents were very upset because the DVD player would have to be replaced over and over again because we kept taking it apart. We would open up the side of the computer and look inside and start putting our fingers in there. My brother in particular would take old Atari game consoles and he would stick a fork where the cartridge should go because on the TV it would go. And we found this interesting. And these kinds of things happened more and more often. I refer to this, it is a beautiful mess. We could probably not make heads or tails of what this is or what the purpose for it. But somebody knows what it's about. Maybe I will try taking something else apart. And at this time, an absolutely wonderful thing happened. People started organizing the information and putting it online. We were no longer stuck sticking forks in things just to see what would happen. We got Make Magazine, Life Hacker, Instructables. All of a sudden, people were sharing information so that everyone could do a little better. And what did we call this? We had, without any intention, created one of the largest peer-to-peer education systems. It's growing. It's still growing. By using the power of the internet, we were able to share we can share our own experiences with everybody else out there. Anyone here who has been working with technology knows you type in an error you get in your compiler, you Google it, and you find that maybe 1,000 other people have the same problem. Hey, I'm not alone. Great. And this starts happening again. This is a cycle. We see a technological trigger. We see a domino effect of further innovations and inventions, and then people start talking. And then it happens all over again. This iteration took 7 years. So if we take a look from the beginning of 4,000 years to build an empire, to 7 years to build one of the largest peer-to-peer education networks unintentionally, here is our relationship with technology. I'd like to jump ahead 2 more years, 2007. Now, I don't mean to talk about this a whole lot. It's a kind of a minor point, but I think it's worth mentioning, is that it was on January 9th, 2007 that we got this, right? It's sort of like, it should be a national holiday, right? Global holiday at this point. And I'm not here to tell you the wonders of the smartphone because, I'm not here to tell you that. But I think as a trigger, something very interesting happened. And people talk about, I can communicate faster with more people and the world is beautiful and everything is wonderful because I have a smartphone. This is not what impresses me. What impresses me is that all of a sudden, all of these people who would say, I'm not a computer person, they disappeared. Where did they go? Because all of a sudden, people could command technology. They had swiping left, right, up, down, making circles, pinch to zoom. Everyone became a user of technology. Very few people were all of a sudden unable to interact with a computer. And in such a short time, in that 7 years, I saw in my classroom, no laptops, we needed a computer lab. Maybe 5 years into this cycle, there was no more computer lab and everyone had a laptop. In fact, we almost lost our classrooms because we could have class with everyone sitting in a lounge with their laptop using an instant messaging application to talk to each other, completely silent. Yet, all of this communication is happening. It was one of the most surreal things I had ever seen. So now, all those computers my students used to have in their laps are now in their hands. At this point, if you have a cell phone sold in the last year, you have a 64-bit computer in your hand. Most of your desktops, all of your desktops, are probably 64-bit computers, unless you have not upgraded in a while. A lot of people like to criticize pictures like this. There's cell phone addiction and these kids aren't running or playing. But I think we had this at one point as well. In fact, the newspaper, and don't get me wrong, I love reading the newspaper. When I lived in New York, reading the Sunday Times, the New York Times was one of my favorite activities. But the New York Times is actually like a shield where you literally cut out people, right? You can't even see the other people. People would hide behind their newspaper. And actually, it was very funny. Into a short while into people getting smartphones, I ran into a couple of people who I must have asked them a question that troubled them because they immediately tried to hide behind their phone, which was the most ridiculous thing I've ever seen because their heads were much larger than the phones then. But we have a tendency to do this. So we have these two situations going on here. To me, they are the same, except for one thing. In the image on the right, the medium forces us into a simple consumption mode. There is no output. It's only input. And with the image on the left, your left, my right, on the left, there's input and output. People are communicating. So this trigger causes people to have an exchange, to have that dialogue. They're receiving information, analyzing the information, and then curating the information, and then passing the information on to somebody else. Now, if you would like to be upset about what is happening with technology and mobile phones, I give you this. This terrifies me. So I'm moving on. Next slide. Okay, and this is what happens again. We have a trigger, people become familiar with it, they start using it, and then all of a sudden, this cycle happens again. Only there's a new attitude now. I'm bored. Every time every time Apple comes out with a new iPhone, what do we hear now? Why doesn't it have this? Why doesn't it have that? How is not enough of this? What happened to that day back in 2007 where the whole world was, everybody's like, oh, Steve Jobs. Now all people do is talk about how awful Apple is, and this 64-bit computer that's more powerful than space shuttles in your hand isn't enough. So maybe this relationship has turned us into a bunch of spoiled children who don't appreciate the amazing things that technology has already done with us. And then think about the people who got a plow so that they could eat. And we're saying this, what's the next trigger? So all of a sudden, these triggers are no longer an amazing moment that we're awestruck with and like, oh my goodness, I can video chat with my parents on the other side of the planet. Now we say, no, what's next? We've gotten used to the cycle itself. Now, happily ever after. Well, I cannot predict the future for you. I can only look at what happened in the past, which is why I have brought you on this journey. I can tell you what's going on right now is that we have this amazing aptitude for instant messaging. We're talking to each other at a rate unseen before. In fact, there's almost too many chat apps, but we probably need this many chat apps to handle the capacity. But we're not just chatting, we're sharing data. We're spending money. Technology has created a view of our world unlike we have ever had before. During the Industrial Revolution, the individual would be described as a cog in the machine. You were just a cogwheel helping the machine move forward. Now, you are a node. You are a node in a much larger social network. And what I find very interesting about this is you being a node in a social network, chatting and doing your instant messaging, you're taking information, you're curating that information, and you're sharing it with other nodes. That all of a sudden, this social network diagram begins to look really familiar. So if we can take all of the elements of technological change and the triggers that result from that and put them into an equation, we have the speed with which things are changing and growing. And this is exponentially faster every time it happens. We have 4,000 years to build an empire, and now, in a matter of hours, I can build you a microprocessor-based signaling device that can, talk to the world. Anyone who has worked with an Arduino or a Raspberry Pi, if you haven't done it already, you've seen the instructions for how to do it on the internet. We take the network, our ability to assimilate information, to gather, curate, and redistribute information, and then we pull together our process of communicating, collaborating, and sharing of information. It can only mean one thing. You are a router. The future is routers. It feels a little anticlimactic, doesn't it? Because the router is this blank box sitting in somebody's kitchen or underneath the sofa, or, we hide it, we're angry at it, but it's what we use every day. They're mounted to buildings. This is how your cell phone talks to all the other cell phones. But it's doing exactly what we have been doing all the way back to the days of early civilization. Through oral tradition, there would be one person in the town who was the router. They would hear the gossip and they would share the gossip. And then someone would travel from one town to another and say, hey, this is what was happening in that town. It's just happening much faster. But you are a router. And because things are changing so fast and iteration is happening at a rate that we can't even conceive, you are upgrading constantly. You have become the trigger. So at this point, it is no longer technology pushing us. It is no longer one individual experimenting with technology. It is all of us using technology because we all have the same goal. I truly believe we all have this wish. Be the trigger. Thank you.